Hi, I'm Jesse the Body Ventura. Relax, you're still watching PBS.
And I'm just Jesse the Body. I'm ahead of my time.
Jesse defies definition. He doesn't fit in a box.
Is it true there's like this wrestler running for office?
I would like to lead the way.
Ventura is a character above all.
Would you legalize drugs?
The most popular governor in the world.
When Jesse Ventura ran for governor of Minnesota, he was certainly an outsider candidate.
Well, we shocked the world.
For one, he was a Vietnam-era veteran turned professional wrestler.
Immediately, Jesse the Body going to work on that left shoulder.
Who was gaining notoriety as an actor and radio host.
Good morning. You're on with Jesse the Body.
Good morning, Jesse. I had a question for Monty about bull snakes.
And had only just gotten his political start as the mayor of Brooklyn Park before throwing himself back in the ring to run for governor in 1998.
You always said all along the only poll that mattered was November 3rd. What do you have to say to all your naysayers?
Well, I was correct, wasn't I?
But Ventura was an outsider for another reason. He didn't run as a Republican or a Democrat. He ran as a third-party candidate under the Reform Party, which had been established by former presidential candidate Ross Perot.
Now, you got to stop letting these people tell you who to vote for. You got to start using your own head.
Ventura only served one term as governor. He didn't run for a second term. But his larger-than-life presence still lingers in our political imagination, especially as some of his original campaign promises finally make their way through the legislature.
Cannabis should be available. It's a prohibition that never should have happened in the first place. So what today is truthfully, it's a day of freedom.
Ventura's governorship often influences the way Minnesotans view our relationship with third-party politics. We elected a pro wrestler as governor, so we must be open to alternative candidates, right? And it is true. We do have a particularly rich history with third-party politics in Minnesota. Our Democratic Party, for example, isn't just the Democratic Party. It's the DFL, which represents the merge of the mainstream Democratic Party with a third party, the Farmer Labor Party, in the 1940s. And this was 50 years before we elected Jesse Ventura as our Reform Party governor. So when you look at this history and you look at the present, like the fact that we've had two pro-marijuana parties on the ballot for the past few decades, it's easy to conclude that Minnesota is unusually open to unique political candidates. But how open to third-party movements are we, actually? I'm Julie Censullo, and this is Playback, the show where we hit rewind and look back at Minnesota history.
I think the merger of the Democratic Party and the Farmer Labor Party signals the end of the third-party tradition in Minnesota political life. I know that may come as a surprise to some folks.
To explore our third-party tradition in Minnesota, I'm speaking with Professor Michael Lansing from Augsburg University in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Michael is a historian of modern United States history with a special interest in political movements. And he is the author of the book Insurgent Democracy, the Non-Partisan League in North American Politics. Michael, thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thanks for having me.
So much of our modern memory of third-party politics in Minnesota is influenced by former Governor Jesse Ventura. So I want to start by talking about him. Do you remember when he was elected?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I was sitting in my bedroom in St. Paul listening to Minnesota Public Radio as the election results rolled in. And like so many other people, I was very surprised by the outcome.
What were you thinking at the time?
Well, I think the other candidates in that particular gubernatorial election had shown some weaknesses and flaws, but I also remember listening to the election party celebration for the Ventura campaign that night. You could just tell there was a vibrancy, a tone in that room, and even the reporters were picking up on that.
Filled with people. It's really an incredible sight. There are, as I've been mentioning all night long, very few people in suits and ties other than reporters like myself. This is a crowd of people who is just regular people.
Were you a history professor yet at the time?
No. I was actually a graduate student in history at the University of Minnesota.
So as a budding historian, did you see his candidacy as being connected to a greater string of third-party politics or any greater movements in Minnesota?
Well, I think at the time I might have, but I think that it was very easy for me to do what so many Minnesotans did at the time and actually continue to do today, which is to think about, oh, wow, there's this long tradition in Minnesota of unusual candidates, of successful independent candidates, of successful third-party runs. And yeah, I think in the fall of 1998, I was thinking that this was somehow connected to that. And, I think over the last 25 years, since that Ventura election win, unearthing this history made me reconsider 1998. And you have to go back to the 1880s to understand 1998.
So take us back to the 1880s. Where does our state's third-party history start?
Yeah, I think in the 1880s in Minnesota and elsewhere across the country, you have third-party movements growing out of associations, growing out of organizations that are coming together that initially are not political. Initially, many of these organizations represent a particular interest or particular community. But one of the most important associations was the Grange. And the Grange is an organization for rural people, mostly farmers, and it creates community amongst farmers. But the idea is to promote and cultivate, pun intended, the work and thinking and care that goes into farming. The Grange is very much against participation in electoral politics. But of course, there's consciousness raising going on. And more often, you are finding farmers who are thinking and talking about the ways in which it is difficult, because of economic structures, to be a farmer and to make a prosperous living, to make what we might call in 21st century terms a middle class living, growing crops for market, because those markets in many ways are rigged against farmers. This is something that's kind of built in structurally to the U.S. economy in the 1870s and 1880s, and you see a broad range of Americans struggling with issues around the question of monopoly, the kind of concentration of corporate capital. With that in mind, these farmers start thinking like, wow, what are we going to do about this? And of course, they get into politics.
So these associations like the Grange were not initially trying to be political, but the rise of corporate monopolies basically was forcing them into politics. So what does their political involvement start to look like?
Well, one of the first things that happens is that as farmers start to think about the possibilities for third parties, they look for allies in the struggle with corporate capital, and they find them in cities. And so it's in these efforts to form coalitions between rural farmers and urban workers that you start to see third parties really, really take off, because they become large enough to have a large enough segment of the voting population to really start to throw their weight around.
And tell me about how some of these political parties start to emerge.
So what you see is these third-party iterations that don't really take off. They get them together, they fail, they kind of collapse, right? It's really in the 1890s that you see third parties take off, and in particular, the People's Party, and in particular in the state of Minnesota.
What was the platform of the People's Party locally and nationally? What did they stand for?
So I think the best way to get at that question is to read to you the preamble of the People's Party platform that was adopted in Omaha in 1892. And this preamble was written by Minnesotan Ignatius Donnelly. He's a really interesting character. He's a land speculator in the late 1850s and early 1860s here in Minnesota. He's a politician, he's a writer, he's a journalist. He's actually, in some ways, well known in his time for kind of fantasy novels or almost science fiction novels of the time. But he takes up the concerns of so many farm families, and as farmers are moving into politics, he becomes an important ally. And he'll, of course, continue to be a leader as the Farmers Alliance movement starts to transform into what in 1892 will become the People's Party at both the national level and at the local and state level here in Minnesota.
Okay, so Ignatius Donnelly, he is the person who writes this preamble to the People's Party. Let's hear it.
The conditions which surround us best justify our cooperation. We meet in the midst of a nation brought to the verge of moral, political, and material ruin. Corruption dominates the ballot box, the legislatures, the Congress, and touches even the ermine of the bench. The people are demoralized. Most of the states have been compelled to isolate the voters at the polling places to prevent universal intimidation and bribery. The newspapers are largely subsidized or muzzled, public opinion silenced, business prostrated, homes covered with mortgages, labor impoverished, and the land concentrating in the hands of capitalists. From the same prolific womb of governmental injustice, we breed the two great classes, tramps and millionaires. That's just the first paragraph.
Yeah, so Ignatius Donnelly here is really positioning the party against this millionaire corporate class. And he ends up being a voice for both farmers and laborers who are not part of that millionaire class.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's important to remember that at the national level, the People's Party is really a coalition of different types of reformers.
So the People's Party is one of the first third parties that really has success in Minnesota. How do they fare in the next couple of years?
Well, so in 1892, you see a national presidential campaign as well as a wide range of local and state campaigns across the country by the People's Party. You see some victories, certainly not at the presidential level, not at the national level in 1892. In 1896, the People's Party mounts another presidential campaign. In that campaign, the Democratic Party, one of the two established major parties, actually kind of it's called fusion, but really what happens is you see this appropriation of the People's Party and its work that plays out in a host of different ways as people say, no, this is not what we should be doing. We're not supposed to be allied with the Democrats. And in other cases, you have politicians that are saying, oh, this is great. This means we can create this local coalition. But what it does mean is really the end of the People's Party as a distinct third party. And it shows the limits of third party organizing.
So even though there are some initial victories, it sounds like the People's Party really struggled to win out over the Democrats who were kind of co-opting their work, as you said. As the People's Party started to dwindle, were there other third-party movements that emerged at this time? Yeah.
When the People's Party collapses, really by 1900, it's basically collapsed. There is another third party that emerges. It's not an especially strong third party, but it is a third party with a national footprint, and that's the Socialist Party.
And the Socialist Party had some success in Minnesota, right? I know we had a socialist mayor in Minneapolis in 1917.
Yeah, so Thomas Van Leer emerges as a candidate for mayor, coming out of the local trade union movement. Minneapolis is one of the most notoriously anti-union cities in the country, and so that particular candidacy is entirely about the struggle between organized labor and organized capital in the city of Minneapolis. And the socialists eke out a victory. He serves that one term. And in many ways, the kind of turn towards patriotism, World War I, as well as the ongoing resistance of organized capital in the city of Minneapolis makes it difficult for him to do much. And it certainly means he does not win a second term. But it is probably the most important socialist victory in the state of Minnesota in the late 19-teens.
So that's a third-party victory that happened in the urban part of the state. But what's going on with those farmers who had previously been involved in politics through things like those farmers groups or the People's Party?
Those farmers who are grappling with these big structural disadvantages that are largely emanating from corporations, both food manufacturers and grain traders based in the Twin Cities, and railroads based in the Twin Cities. In the early 1900s, they engage in a wide range of cooperative movements. They are like, look, third parties don't work. The People's Party didn't work. We learned that in the previous generation. So we're going to continue to kind of sit tight and focus on economic cooperation and not think about politics. But they reach a breaking point. In 1915, they create a membership-based political organization that endorses candidates. The idea being is that you come up with a platform and then you take it to candidates of any political affiliation, of any political party, and say, if you are, willing to commit yourself to support this particular platform, well, then we will deliver votes. So it's a very, very powerful innovation. It's really about bringing the lessons of both cooperation and the failure of the third-party movement in the 1890s. It's bringing that kind of collected wisdom together and saying, actually, we can create something new and really different by bringing cooperation into politics. They're very successful.
So this new group I know from reading your work is called the Non-Partisan League. And it actually gets its start among farmers in North Dakota. How does it end up playing a role in Minnesota politics?
Yeah, it's such a great question because it's not something you would expect.
Yeah.
These are farmers organizing. They have these victories in Bismarck, North Dakota at the state level in North Dakota in 1916. By 1918, they are clearly making an effort to become a national movement, and they are organizing in a wide range of states. And as they become a national movement, they get more and more attention. It's a membership organization. They have more and more members. They move the headquarters from North Dakota to St. Paul. St. Paul is a place where you might put a headquarters if you really want to win a big victory in 1918. And of course, Minnesota is high on the list for the Non-Partisan League as a state with real potential because the economic situation is so similar to what is happening in North Dakota.
So when the Non-Partisan League moves its headquarters to St. Paul, that opens up an opportunity for this coalition of urban laborers and rural farmers like we had seen in the People's Party to kind of emerge again, right?
Yeah, there's this core belief that fundamentally corporate interests are going to disadvantage both organized laborers and organized farmers. And so there are members of the leadership of the Non-Partisan League who start to explicitly identify the ways in which connections might be made with organized labor. How do you create solidarity across these differences? Well, you have people show up for each other. Again, rural people in the late 19-teens and urban people have different issues. But if you focus on the same shared self-interest, which is growing corporate power and the ways in which that drives down wages or doesn't permit farmers to get what they think is a fair price for their crops every year, if you focus relentlessly on that, what do we have in common? You can create bonds and you can create promises. So showing up for each other is absolutely critical. And so in 1918, 1919, 1920, you see the Non-Partisan League really at the core of an effort to bring farmers and workers together in a political coalition that will upend the two established parties.
Yeah, let's talk about how they upend the established parties. Because at this point, the Non-Partisan League is still not a party, right? That's built into their name. So what changes?
In 1921, you see changes to election law. And so what happened here in Minnesota in 1921 was that first, parties would meet in convention in order to identify primary candidates. And second, any primary election candidate from either party who lost could not then become a candidate in the general election. And these are two absolutely critical ways to force this Non-Partisan League model of a non-party participating as essentially a political cooperative. It forces them to become a third party.
And why does that change matter for the Non-Partisan League?
Because the Non-Partisan League model, which is to not be a party, no longer works. You have to be a party because you have to have an endorsing convention to participate in the primary.
So that forces the Non-Partisan League to become a party, but that kind of undercuts what was working so well about their non-party strategy. So do they do well as a party?
Well, nationally, the Non-Partisan League collapses. But here in Minnesota, there's still a lot of momentum. And you've got these farmers who are really committed to politics and committed to education and committed to economic cooperation. And so that alliance between farmers and laborers, one that's really born in the 1880s, you see that settle in. And so that's how you see the birth of the Farmer Labor Party. And by 1924, that is a very kind of firmly put together organization. It's the Great Depression, however, that really allows the Farmer Labor Party to take off.
Factories shut down, businesses passed out of existence, and the ranks of those already unemployed swelled into a huge army. Unemployment swept the nation like a horrible pestilence.
The collapse on Wall Street in 1929, the kind of economic slide that starts in 1930 and really deepens by 1931, creates an opening for the Farmer Labor Party. And of course, it's the election of Floyd Olson of Minneapolis in 1930 to governor of Minnesota that sets the stage for the farmer labor ascendancy in the state through the 1930s.
The Farmer Labor Party does not wish to confiscate the property of anyone. What we want is to create an economic system so that we can produce enough wealth to satisfy the needs of all the people.
So Floyd Olson is our first third-party governor in Minnesota. Tell me a little bit about him and how he helps the Farmer Labor Party go from having smaller local victories to having a more statewide platform.
Yeah, Floyd B. Olson, child of immigrants, grows up on the near north side, relatively impoverished background, kind of a self-made person. By the mid-20s, he's Hennepin County attorney, which of course is an elected office. As Hennepin County attorney, he's involved in especially Minneapolis city politics, which in the 1920s are complicated. There's a real struggle in Minneapolis in the 1920s against the power of corporations. And so there's some political hay to be made in, looking out for the little person, looking out for the working person, calling for different types of reform. And so Olson gets swept up in the farmer labor movement. And one of the reasons he's successful, it's not just because the economy is going badly, but because the party itself has been all about getting voters to think about themselves as more than just consumers, as people who can shape the world, as people who can engage in political processes and actually change the world around them. So that means that there's a ideologically committed base in 1930 when Olson runs for the governor's office. And that's a concerted effort that takes time and takes energy, but I would also argue is a foundation for the Farmer Labor Party's success.
We're asking that the government fix prices so as to give the farmer a fair price for his commodity. And if government does that, as it has done in the case of oil, in the case of lumber, in the case of a great many industrial products, we, the Middle West and the Far West, will be able to buy a great many of the products that are made by industry and cannot now be sold because agriculture has no buying power.
Yeah, I know a lot of people remember Floyd Olson for some of his more progressive economic policies. Like he proposed a graduated income tax and he helped increase unemployment benefits. How do you see his impact on Minnesota, especially as a third-party politician?
There's a broader question about what Floyd Olson actually did that was different. For instance, during the Minneapolis trucker strike in 1934, in which Minneapolis became one of the national hotspots in labor strife, and people were killed in the streets of Minneapolis, both law enforcement officials and regular working citizens, where the civil authorities lost control of the entire city for days at a time because of this workers' rebellion. In that conflict, Floyd Olson is not necessarily, one might imagine, on the side of those striking workers, and in fact is deemed with some suspicion. So on the question of unionism, there are limits to Floyd Olson's kind of policymaking. He famously calls himself a radical, but it's not clear that he is in terms of his policies. Controlling state government means that you are definitely doing more than the established parties for farmers and laborers in all the different ways in which state government works, in all the little ways, in all the ways that are both seen and unseen. But in terms of massive policy shifts, you don't necessarily see that. You do see the rapid decline of the Democratic Party across the state. The Farmer Labor Party really becomes the first party of two parties. It's the Farmer Labor Party and the Republican Party. And one of the reasons that's possible is because Floyd Olson actually isn't that radical. That may be one of the reasons he remains so popular. This is the Great Depression, so creating a variety of relief programs, but there are other governors doing the same kind of thing without the third party moniker. And those relief programs, of course, are very useful for ensuring votes. And so he's reelected multiple times. And of course, in 1936, when he dies, he's preparing a run for the U.S. Senate. And at his funeral, thousands of Minnesotans arrive. He's a very popular politician.
That's interesting. So after Olson dies in 1936, who takes up leadership of the Farmer Labor Party?
You see a farmer labor politician named Elmer Benson from Appleton, Minnesota. So this is more of the farmer wing of farmer labor. Elmer Benson becomes governor and is governor from 1936 to 1938. And that's a very difficult moment for the Farmer Labor Party because the coalition starts to fall apart. There are at least two factions or two wings in the Farmer Labor Party, and they go after each other. Hjalmar Peterson from East Central Minnesota and a prominent farmer labor politician goes after Elmer Benson, and he suggests that Elmer Benson is surrounded by communists. And from 1935 to 1938, there were some members of CPUSA around. There were some spaces in which farmer labor politicians would work with a wide range, everything from New Deal liberals to members of the Communist Party. And that's not that unusual nationally either. You also see a lot of anti-Semitism, of course, at that moment, coming from Peterson. So these internal divisions, this internal strife in the Farmer Labor Party really weaken it.
So with the Farmer Labor Party kind of divided within itself, do the other two parties, and in particular the Democrats who had been weaker during this time period, Do they try to take advantage of this moment to gain power?
The Democrats in the state of Minnesota aren't able to take advantage of it. It's the Republican Party who is able to take advantage of it. And, in 1938, you see the end of the farmer labor control of the governor's office. You start to see Republican gains. Minnesota had traditionally been a largely Republican state with some exceptions up to that point. And this is the situation as you move into the early 40s. With the Farmer Labor Party, really the second party in the state, the Republican Party really kind of emerging as the significant player, and a small Democratic Party trying to reorganize itself into something new.
So the Democratic Party is looking to make a change. What does that look like?
Well, I would direct you to 1943. World War II is raging.
This front is a stationary siege line, but fighting goes on incessantly.
There are these massive transformations. The Great Depression economy suddenly becomes a wartime economy in which you go from not having enough jobs to not having enough workers. And there's a certain level of prosperity that goes with war. Of course, there's also rationing. There's intense suffering as casualty lists start coming back from fronts all around the world. But there's this transformative effect that war has on the United States and on Minnesota. And in 1943, this effort to think about how are we going to make sure Franklin Roosevelt gets elected, Minnesota's kind of a swing state. It's not clear that Minnesota will vote for Franklin Roosevelt. And so a call goes out suggesting that the Democratic Party merge with the Farmer Labor Party. There had been talk of this before, but it gets really serious in 1943. There's a young, up-and-coming, not yet elected young man who lives in Minneapolis named Hubert H. Humphrey. Humphrey is going to be running for mayor of Minneapolis. He is kind of emerging as an example of a different type of Democrat than most Minnesotans had seen.
And Humphrey, even though he's a Democrat, he has allies on the farmer labor side, right?
But perhaps it is time that we as a nation also dedicate ourselves to the preservation of certain rights for the American farmer as the custodian of the very basis of our national life.
In the meantime, on the farmer labor side, Elmer Benson is still really one of the leaders of the Farmer Labor Party. And Benson is surrounded by this coalition. Again, a coalition of not just farmers and laborers, but members of the Communist Party and members of the Socialist Workers' Party and some liberals that are unhappy with the Republican Party and don't quite think that the Democratic Party is all that it's cracked up to be. But they're all committed to these broader issues of reform, of internationalism, thinking about a post-World War II America in which there's more opportunity and less discrimination. And they're like, well, yeah, maybe we can talk to these people. Our self-interest is also connected to a Roosevelt presidency. And that's the context in which conversations come together in 1944 and create this merger.
Got it. So this is the merge that will leave us with the DFL, the Democratic Farmer Labor Party that we still have today. So you have people like Hubert Humphrey on the Democratic side and people like Elmer Benson on the farmer labor side and all of these other groups that are kind of working together around some shared interest to make this merge happen. Is the merge generally well received by both parties?
Well, so mergers of this sort are difficult. Again, the bringing together is hard in political venues and political spaces. But there's a foundation that's laid by people like Nellie Stone Johnson.
And Nellie Stone Johnson, that's a name some people may be familiar with. She was an African-American civil rights activist and a labor organizer in Minneapolis. Can you tell me about her and how she helps ease some of the tension in this merge?
Yeah, so she's raised on a dairy farm. She is kind of absolutely committed non-partisan leaguer in this rural space, moves to the Twin Cities, becomes very active in her union. She's also very active in civil rights groups across the city of Minneapolis. Nellie Stone Johnson is a person who seems to care less about ideological differences and more about what are we doing that we can work on together? Again, what's our shared self-interest? And let's focus relentlessly on that. So she's willing to go into the room and talk to anybody, or more conservative elements of organized labor, as well as former radicals from former traditions, as well as people up on the range, as well as this young liberal up-and-comer named Hubert Humphrey.
Yeah, here she is in a 1991 Twin Cities PBS interview in which she articulates that idea.
Nellie Stone Johnson, how would you describe your politics? I would suppose right off the reel I would say people politics, just plain and simple. My background is farm and involved with labor, civil and human rights, women's issues, and certainly racial minority rights.
She's less concerned with labels, and so that approach, which some historians refer to as kind of the Popular Front approach, at this moment in the 1930s, where you see these coalitions of liberals and radicals, she embodies that, and it's people like her that become the glue of this merger, as well as the need for Humphrey to transform the Democratic Party's reputation, which he can do when he has allies like Nellie Stone Johnson in the room.
What do you mean by that he needed Nellie Stone Johnson to help transform the Democrats' reputation?
Nationally, of course, the Democratic Party controls the American South. It's associated with racism and segregation. While many white Minnesotans find that distasteful, they are, of course, engaging their own forms of racism and discrimination. But they find the kind of open racism in the South distasteful. They associate that with the Democratic Party. What Humphrey does is he's very careful to say, no, actually, the New Deal Democrats are not really about this. So this bringing together civil rights and the rights of organized labor in a new coalition, kind of redefining what it means to be a Democrat, that's what Humphrey brings to the table.
Is Humphrey's concern for civil rights sincere, or is it a political move to bring in the farmer labor rights?
So Humphrey is legitimately concerned and committed to civil rights, and he doesn't need the farmer labor people to tell him that. What he does need is support and help, because he has to take on the internal elements in the Democratic Party at the national level, because the Democratic Party is deeply divided over race at the national level. And that tension in the National Democratic Party was one that Humphrey fundamentally had to face, because he decided to run for the U.S. Senate from Minnesota in 1948.
Yeah, and that's the year that he gives that famous speech at the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia.
To those who say that this civil rights program is an infringement on states' rights, I say this: the time has arrived in America for the Democratic Party to get out of the shadows of states' rights and to walk forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights.
And so Humphrey really pushes the Democratic Party to embrace civil rights on a national level.
He does. And in fact, by then, he's also pushed out most of the hardcore farmer labor rights from the Democratic Party. Yeah. Because there's a split over communism and previous associations with communism in 1947 and 1948. But of course, Humphrey will win the Senate seat and will secure control over the Democratic Farmer Labor Party by pushing Elmer Benson and others out completely, again, over the question of anti-communism.
Yeah, here's Elmer Benson in an interview in 1976 where he reflects on the merge.
So the Farmer Labor Party, which had started out with the purpose of being a third party and hopefully gaining control of the state, do you look on it as it continued to move forward, or this was a step backwards for the party?
Well, I think it's a step backward. I certainly prefer the present Democratic Farm Labor Party to the Republican Party, but they're not as progressive as I'd like to see them.
What do you think of that idea that the farmer labor ideals were not necessarily carried through into the merge of the two parties?
I would argue a lot of people see continuity between the Farmer Labor Party and the DFL. And of course, it's very tempting to, especially for some Minnesotans who see themselves as having left-of-center politics, or what are sometimes termed progressive politics. It's very easy to get lulled into a kind of romanticized vision of, it's the DFL, farmer labor is a critical part of that. But there's actually not nearly as much continuity between farmer labor and the Democratic Farmer Labor Party as we might wish for, at least those Minnesotans. I think the merger of the Democratic Party and the Farmer Labor Party signals the end of the third party tradition in Minnesota political life. I know that may come as a surprise to some folks, but I would argue that it's really from the mid-1880s to about 1950, where the third party tradition is very strong in the state of Minnesota and unusual. I mean, there are other states that have this kind of thing going on, but not to the same extent and not for that duration. And that at the core of all those movements between 1880 and 1950, you have efforts to combine farmers and laborers together.
So you're arguing that this really rich tradition of third party politics in Minnesota dies down after the merge of the Democrats and the farmer labor rights. But we do continue to see some strong third-party candidates in Minnesota, right?
So the merger of the Democratic Party and the Farmer Labor Party really means the end of the third-party tradition, even though we don't often think about it that way. What we do see is the emergence of independent candidates. And that is a subtle but significant difference. So Charles Stenvig is elected mayor of Minneapolis in June of 1969. Charles Stenvig is a self-declared independent.
I've been sought out by numerous citizens of Minneapolis who are not happy with the way our city government is being run today. And at this time, along with my family, I would like to say that I will be a candidate, an independent candidate for the position of mayor of Minneapolis.
People always think about Minneapolis as liberal, as a very liberal city. This was not true before Hubert Humphrey and the merger of the Democratic Party and the Farmer Labor Party, but it's very true after that merger. But the 1960s and the many struggles of the 1960s around questions of race in particular sweep up Minneapolis, whether we're talking about urban Native people or we're talking about African American people, we're talking about housing segregation or employment discrimination, whether we're talking about racialized policing or just various everyday indignities. And you have this independent candidate, self-funded, no party, no apparatus, but most importantly, he's a cop. He promised to take the handcuffs off the police. And in many ways, he did that. He is careful to continue to call on white working class concerns, and he wins the general election in 1969. Stenvig represents this independent candidate tradition that comes out of very specific circumstances. His supporters in 1969 are not what you would think of Minneapolis in 1969. They're largely white working class. Some of them are connected to an emerging evangelical movement. They are for lower property taxes, and Stenvig promises law and order. Stenvig ends up not seeking any kind of higher office. He leaves the mayor's job and kind of fades into oblivion.
Right.
Kind of a footnote to history, and yet such an important one shaping Minneapolis.
I'm interested in this distinction you're making between third-party candidates and independent candidates, because I think we often use those two terms interchangeably. So how do you see an independent candidate as different from a third-party candidate?
Independent candidates often emerge for very specific reasons that are related to that particular moment or that particular election. There are so many variables, so many factors. But they are independent candidates who are not associated with one of the two major parties, but they also don't often spend a lot of time investing in a movement, investing in the creation of a party around them. They may lay claim to a party name or title, but they're not investing time and energy in creating something that lasts beyond them and their time in office. And so that's why this distinction between a third party and an independent candidate, I think, is so important.
Sure, that makes sense. Do we see other independent candidates gain popularity in the later half of the 20th century?
One of the variables for these kind of late 20th century independent candidates, locally and nationally, is that they usually emerge when the two major parties aren't satisfying voters on some level around at least one or two issues. And that's certainly the case in the 1990s with the rise of Ross Perot nationally. You know, a businessman runs for the presidency in 1992 as an independent.
What do I want?
Yes, we'll start from that. Yes.
Personally, nothing. But what does our organization of millions of people want? We want government reform as job one. We want a government that comes from us, the people, from we the people, not at us from special interests and lobbyists in Washington.
Here in Minnesota, he gets a little less than 25% of the vote. I think that's 18% nationally. Okay. So you do see in Minnesota more people attracted to the Perot campaign. Perot decides to invest time and energy in the creation of a party to kind of shift from being an independent candidate into an actual third party that has legs. That Reform Party is established in 1995.
And the Reform Party is the party that Jesse Ventura will eventually run on.
Mayor Jesse the Body Ventura. Ventura is thinking about being the Reform Party's candidate for governor. If you were to do it, what would you want to do?
What would I want to do? I think that it's a smart idea to have a governor who has no political affiliation to either of the two parties. That way that governor can sit there when a bill comes forward, he can sign it or veto it on the merits of the bill and not political party pressure.
The Reform Party locally is interested in picking up on and in some ways playing on what many Minnesotans understand themselves to be, which is a third-party state. And so here's where you see this tension between memory and history. Memory is what people choose to remember about the past, or what communities choose to remember about the past. History, of course, is the interpretation of the past from primary sources. So as a historian, I'm really interested in those tensions. And this is a moment where locally, people who are really vested in a kind of a centrist ideological politics say, well, like, we could have a third party here. We have this long third party tradition. We're going to try to get this Reform Party going in the state of Minnesota, and it's going to be more important than any particular candidate. What you see in the 1990s with the Reform Party is an effort to call up and to call on this tradition in Minnesota life and get regular people involved in politics and saying, like, you're tired of the Democrats, you're tired of the Republicans. You know, we have policies that might be socially liberal and more fiscally conservative, and that's a combination you're not seeing in the two major parties at that time, they argue. And we need you to get engaged. In that sense, calling on this broader, small d Democratic tradition, you see locally at the state level, the Reform Party trying to do that and getting people together and saying, like, you know, there is a different way, there is a different possibility.
I think another way we often want to connect someone like Jesse Ventura to a movement like the Farmer Labor Party, and perhaps erroneously want to connect them, is that they are both popular movements. The Farmer Labor Party is a popular movement because it calls on this tradition of populism, of building a movement of working class voters. And Jesse Ventura is a popular candidate in the sense that he is simply popular, right? Like, he's an actor, he's a wrestler, he's entertaining. And he brings in a swath of voters that wouldn't necessarily vote otherwise. Do you see those two ideas of popular candidates as being connected?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I would describe Ventura as a populist because, of course, again, I want to harken back on this older tradition in American political life and in Minnesota's political life. That said, the context is so different in the 1980s and 1990s. So, of course, the emergence of Ronald Reagan, a movie actor, first as governor of California in the late 1960s, and then, of course, as president of the United States from 1980 to 1988, is kind of the most obvious indication of the collapse of these boundaries between entertainment and politics and the ways in which voting and popular culture, those kinds of boundaries are also changing or becoming much more fluid. And I think Jesse Ventura, of course, really embodies that shift in American culture and politics more broadly. And in some ways, he illustrates it as beautifully as Ronald Reagan does. So you have this veteran who, after his military service, becomes a professional wrestler. As a professional wrestler, he builds first a regional reputation and then becomes a national figure through professional wrestling, which is a form of entertainment, and decides he, wants to run for municipal office here in the Twin Cities suburbs, and does so and is successful. And shows, of course, he argued that, he was a thinking person as well as a celebrity.
I wanted to know whether we call you Governor Ventura or Governor Nevada.
Well, actually, Tom, I've changed that moniker. I'm no longer the body. I'm Jesse the Mind Ventura. And so I don't make my living with my body anymore. I make it with my mind.
He's also very entertaining. He runs a more entertaining campaign. Whether he's at the state fair, his commercials are better. We can go right down the line. It's literally more entertaining. And if the boundaries between politics and entertainment are collapsing, that means there's an opening. That means that that's something that 30 years before simply would not have been effective, but proved to be profoundly effective, especially bringing in people who normally don't vote. This is another thing about independent candidates. Stenvig in 1969, in his run for mayor of Minneapolis, brought a number of people to the polls who normally don't vote. You see Ventura do the same thing in 1998, bringing people to the polls who normally don't vote. And you do that by being different.
So we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked a lot about different third-party movements and independent movements, and we've talked about how these movements have both shaped our state and in some ways how they have failed to shape our state. I want to end with this idea that you brought up at the beginning, that perhaps Minnesota's history with third parties is a little more complicated than we like to think. How do you see a figure like Jesse Ventura fitting into our history of third-party politics?
I would say that the Jesse Ventura story helps sustain this vision that many Minnesotans want to have, that we're different somehow, and different in ways that we appreciate and that are broadly appreciated. And, the fact that Ventura serves a full term in office, does not invest a lot of time and energy in building the Reform Party, leaves a lot of bruised relationships because he does not invest time and energy in building the party in the way that Floyd Olson helped sustain and further build the Farmer Labor Party in the 1930s. Ventura had that opportunity and chose not to pursue it. And he never got more than 40% of the vote either. Yeah. So if he had run for re-election and won, then we can start to have a different conversation about Ventura. But the fact he's one term, decides not to run again, that's a different kind of candidate than Ignatius Donnelly or Floyd Olson or Elmer Benson. Really different, really different. So I think it's really important to tease out the ways in which we can be brought into or attracted to stories about ourselves that don't necessarily capture the full or more thoughtful experiences of that time.
Michael Lansing, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Playback is produced by me, Julie Censullo, with editorial support from Katie Thornton. Luke Heikela is our production manager. Lisa Blackstone is our archival producer, and Olivia Pelham is our production assistant. Eric Poggle recorded and mixed this episode. Daniel Bergen is our executive producer. Support for this podcast comes from the WEM Foundation Fund for History Production and Education. Playback is a production of Minnesota Experience Studios from Twin Cities PBS.